Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. Welcome back to another Iron Age book review. Now, Marion G. Harman has been publishing independent novels since before there was an Iron Age label to apply to him. But he has mostly published independently, and he's multidisciplinary. There is a Wearing the Cape RPG book available if that interests you. In fact, I believe most of the slowdown in his fiction publishing can be attributed to working on that particular project. Independent, multidisciplinary author? Whether he would consider himself a member of a deliberately independent-minded writing movement or not, he kind of fits the mold. And since I apply the label more with an eye towards behavior than ideology, I think he fits here pretty well. As I've said before, I look at these things more as descriptors than proscriptions. Now, the book I'm reviewing here is the first in what he is calling the Capes series. I think it's very interesting for a number of reasons. Harman has a very well-established superhero world. There are, as of this recording, a total of 9 books in the mainline series that Harman writes, which is called Wearing the Cape. There's also a spin-off book called Big Easy Nights that focuses on a side character from the Wearing the Cape series. Rising Tides, which is the first entry in the Capes series, looks a lot like Big Easy Nights. It's a spin-off series set in the same continuity and, in fact, the same city as most of Wearing the Cape, but it focuses on a completely different character. In this case, one we don't really see a whole lot of in the mainline story. In fact, I think he only appears once, and that's in a short story that happens after the 9th book. In point of fact, I don't think the character of Kingston, who is the protagonist of Rising Tides, is ever directly mentioned in the Wearing the Cape series, so you don't need a great deal of familiarity with Harman's other work to understand him. The rest of the story, well, we'll get into that. Anyway, I'm always fascinated by the way authors choose to approach playing in their own ponds this way. It's very tricky. And the last time Harman did it, he only had 2 books in his series, not 9. Or technically 10 if you count Big Easy Nights, which is not one of the 9 books in the Wearing the Cape series. Now, I'm not going to try and recap Wearing the Cape here in this video. My goal is to review this book as a jumping on point to the series. But I will hit some of the basic world building just so you're not lost. And Harman does that early in his book anyway, so it is technically a part of the review. At some point in the late 20th century or early 21st century, we're not entirely sure when, Earth undergoes what is known as the event, a period of 2.3 seconds of sensory deprivation that affects everyone on Earth at the same time. The event is accompanied by a power blackout and a failure of most electronic devices, which causes a lot of problems. Turning a plane off and on in the middle of the sky, not a great idea, just to give one example. Presumably, up until that point, the history of the world was much like ours, with the exception of some of the major political figures. Their president of the United States at the time was not one that has ever served in that office here, just to give one example. After the event, people who are in stressful, life-threatening situations, or sometimes in other states of extremely altered mindset or emotion, there is a possibility people undergo a superhuman breakthrough. They cease to be a regular person, they become a mutant or a superhero, or, fill in your comic book idea here, at least in the US. There are a lot of factors that influence exactly how you break through, and your cultural conditioning seems to be one of them. So in other parts of the world, people tend to develop superhuman breakthroughs that reflect their culture. Masters of magic, or daoshi, or martial artists. The list of potential superhuman breakthroughs is about as long as the list of people in the world. Actually longer, because we know at least one person breaks through in different ways in divergent timelines. But that's really not important to discussing Rising Tides. The long and the short of it is, there's a 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 2,000 chance that any person under stress goes through a breakthrough. The story of Rising Tides begins 14 to 15 years after the event. The first book, Wearing the Cape, actually takes place only 10 years after the event, so some time has passed in the world from that point. If that seems like a bit of a rough number, that's why. But we're primarily interested in Kingston's story in this review, so we're just going to stick to talking about him. So we open up with Rising Tides as Kingston is pretty much leaving his job. He's some kind of finance guy, and the company he works for gets shut down for criminal activity. Not that he knows anything about it, but it does put him out of a job. As soon as he leaves his job, he gets caught in a terrorist attack. And being something of a non-confrontational kind of person, and an ex-track team member, Kingston runs for it. And he's so good at running for it that he goes through a superhuman breakthrough and teleports his butt out of Dodge. This is a really strong standalone introduction to the character and to the world. It kind of gives us a sense of what can make a superhuman breakthrough. It gives us a sense of how Kingston reacts to pressure, and it lets us get into a really neat way of looking at the world, because Kingston, as soon as he develops the ability to teleport, has to start thinking about the world in new and different ways. So we're really quickly being onboarded to the way the character is going to think and act throughout the story. We get some basic world building, just enough to understand how breakthroughs work, and that Kingston lives in this society of superhumans where things called crisis aid and intervention teams, essentially super teams, deal with superhuman threats and very high-powered, quote-unquote, mundane threats. At that point, we go through a very interesting series of events. We follow Kingston through the aftermath of the terrorist attack and the aftermath of developing superpowers at the same time. It's a very interesting blending of elements, and to go with it, we also learn that Kingston's roommate is a part of Humanity First, a group of people who are very, very scared of superhuman breakthroughs. There's a lot of conflict and tension going on in his life, and it's very interesting. I was looking forward to seeing how it would all shake out. Kingston gets some basic training, he finds a new potential job with a private security firm, and he goes on his first job with them. A job that sends him overseas to rescue a political prisoner, which is a bit of a sudden jump from civilian scrambling to avoid a terrorist attack to international man of mystery, but there's a pretty justifiable reason for it. He's backed by a super hacker that goes by Red, because she has red hair, and the company itself is very well seasoned, plus he's a teleporter. There's a lot of things teleporters can do to keep themselves from ever being in too much danger. In this opening act of the story, I didn't really have a whole lot of problems with the narrative. I should note that this part of the story is very heavily interwoven with the 9th book in the Wearing the Cape series. Not that Kingston has any direct interactions with Astra or Artemis or any of the mainline members of the Chicago Sentinels, but the terrorist attack that begins the book is a major inciting incident in that book as well. So this part of Kingston's story has to play out in parallel to the events of that story. And there's enough landmarks there that you can tell what Kingston is doing in what parts of that book and what the Sentinels are doing, and vice versa. I don't know how disruptive those elements will be for first-time readers. Again, Rising Tides really feels like a jumping-on point, and having all of these plot elements introduced and then resolved by a group of superheroes who are operating almost entirely off-screen might be a little bit jarring. But what I personally found really jarring is that Kingston is taken into a pocket dimension by a deity-class breakthrough, and he's just sort of there for about 10 months. He's literally off the table, and I feel like this time skip is included for a couple of reasons. First, it puts him beyond the end of Wearing the Cape Book 9. Second, it gives him a chance to really achieve mastery with his powers, without the many forces that are hostile to him actually being able to affect him. It does feel a little bit inorganic. Yes, there are breakthroughs who develop precognitive abilities, and they can kind of see the future implications of their current actions, and they tend to have a lot of other powers to go along with that. So if you're a long-time reader of Wearing the Cape, what happens there is not super surprising to you, and you recognize a lot of the characters who kind of show up and play a hand in that. But looking at the book as an experience for first-time readers, it is probably going to come off as quite jarring and a little bit artificial. even though it does play entirely in rules that Harmon has already established for his world. I'm not sure how well it's going to work, honestly. But more than that, there is a very bizarre dislocation to it. Kingston's departure for the pocket dimension is at the end of the first act. But we experience the time in the pocket dimension at the end of the second act. That probably sounds a little bit weird, but believe me, it's just as weird to read it. Again, as a reader who's already familiar with Omega-class breakthroughs and who has seen their shenanigans in several previous books, I could kind of follow what was going on and even the logic of how it would work both as a storytelling choice and as an in-character choice, with the Omega Breakthrough acting as a chess master using Kingston as a piece. That didn't make it any less jarring or unnatural in the way the story was presented. On top of that, one of the major conflicts set up at the beginning of the book is that Kingston is a superhuman breakthrough, and his roommate, September, is a humanity firster. She doesn't like breakthroughs at all. But one of the consequences of Kingston's 10-month disappearance is that he gets outed to his family as a superhuman breakthrough in his absence, and his family in this case includes September. That kind of undercuts one of his major conflicts in the book. And this may actually be a place where something in the book is more disappointing to me as a longtime reader of the series than it is to first-time readers. The conflict between humanity first and the superhuman breakthroughs of the world is a long-running theme in Wearing the Cape. The story between September and Kingston is one of the first times we've gotten any strong indications of what drives people to humanity first at all. I mean, most people can probably fill in the blanks if they've read anything like X-Men or other works like that, but Wearing the Cape seeks to be a little more grounded than your typical Marvel comic, and it presents characters with a lot more nuance. So I was kind of interested in seeing the tension and the motivations of humanity firsters explored a little bit more than we got in this book. And I think one of the reasons we don't see a whole lot of that is simply because September makes her peace with Kingston being a breakthrough off screen. It was a very disappointing story beat for me, but I don't know if most new readers are going to take it that way, because if this was my first introduction to the world, I would find it probably a little bit grating to have a protagonist whose closest friend just kicks up her feet and nags him about being a breakthrough for the entire book, which I feel is probably what it would come off as if there was constant conflict between the two characters over Kingston's status as a breakthrough. That aside, the second and third act of Rising Tides focuses on Kingston kind of establishing his identity and going independent. He doesn't get a crisis aid and intervention certification. He's considered a vigilante on the streets of Chicago. That technically makes him a criminal, even though all he really does is beat up on supervillains, or save people who need to get out of a spot of tension. There is an overarching story arc that focuses on a terror plot, executed, of course, by Humanity First, but most of the story is short vignettes that focus on Kingston dealing with one problem or another as they creep up, acquiring and getting familiar with his superhero gear, and so on and so forth. It's very interesting to see him establish his reputation, kind of develop good relations with some of the B and C lister superheroes around Chicago, and get his codename Killjoy. All in all, it's a very solid first outing for a new superhero, whether in prose or in panels. I don't have a whole lot more to say about it, other than to say I think Kingston is a really neat character. I think his relations are quite strong. Harmon has always been good at writing grounded superheroes that have believable friendships and family relations, and yet still have high-stakes action as a big part of their day job, quote-unquote. There's not a whole lot of the sad sack Peter Parker syndrome here. On top of that, Harmon's action scenes are very creative and tend to exploit the superpowers he's come up with in very cool ways. Kingston is no exception to that, so expect to see a lot of clever use of teleportation as Kingston works to solve problems. outside of the first act, there's not a whole lot to indicate that Astra and the Chicago Sentinels are protagonists in another story going on. In fact, with one admittedly quite significant exception, there's no direct contact between Kingston and the protagonists of Wearing the Cape at all. He's very much a street-level hero who keeps Chicago safe, while Astra and company are off defending the planet and the multiverse. And very rarely are the two going to meet. All in all, I think it's a very solid bit of storytelling. But is it a good jumping on point? Not really. I think if you read this, you're not going to be any more ready to join Astra on her future endeavors in Book 10 of Wearing the Cape than you were before. But it is a good way to dip your toe into the world and get a sense of what Astra's adventures are going to be like. If you don't want to commit yourself to reading Wearing the Cape, all 9 books and 2 short stories of it, but you still have an interest in the world, Cape's Book 1 might be for you. That said, I think Wearing the Cape is still the best way to get into it because that is pretty much a self-contained superhero adventure story, and so much of that half of the world is so different from what Kingston lives in that I think you really just have to experience them separately, which is why I think it's also a good thing that Harmon has broken capes away from Wearing the Cape, as odd as that may sound. So if you like superhero lit, I can give Rising Tides a recommendation with no real hesitation. That said, if you've never read superhero lit, I would recommend starting with Wearing the Cape rather than Rising Tides. I think it's just a more accessible first foray into the genre. If you don't like superheroes at all, I don't think Harmon does anything that's going to change your mind on the genre, whether in prose or in panels. So if that's just not your cup of tea, you can probably give this a miss. That said, I really enjoyed my time reading the book. If you watch my reviews because you tend to agree with the way I look at literature, you'll probably enjoy it too. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.